It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed. For most of the students at the charter school, it was another afternoon of lessons, counting down the minutes until the bell rang. But for one student, everything changed just as the school day was supposed to end. It was 9th grade, and he had just finished his classes, eager to head over to his base school for band practice. His dad, a teacher at the base school, had always been a constant in his life, and he figured that, like any other day, he'd see him after practice, maybe even grab dinner at home if things went smoothly. Little did he know, that routine would be shattered in ways he couldn't predict. The sound of the intercom buzzing interrupted the usual chatter in the classroom, followed by an announcement that would make his stomach drop. "We're going on lockdown," the voice cracked through the speakers, cold and impersonal. No explanation, no reason given. At first, it didn't make sense. Lockdown? Was there a drill? Maybe just a precautionary thing, but no one was saying anything. No one knew what was going on. Tension settled over the room, thick and suffocating, as teachers hurried to secure the doors, pulling down blinds and turning off lights. There was no noise now, just a rising sense of unease. He tried to text his father, of course his first instinct, his lifeline. But the school's terrible service, something everyone knew all too well, made sure that message never went through. His father, in a classroom somewhere on the other side of the district, wouldn't get it. And that thought gnawed at him. Why wouldn't they tell them what was going on? Why did they need to be in the dark about something so serious? The answers didn't come until later, when the news spread through the school, carried by the phones of other students. Apparently, someone had posted something disturbing on Snapchat. A series of pictures showing guns being cleaned, polished metal, gleaming under the harsh light of a dim room, and a threatening message. It was clear enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. "Fuck at insert name. BC of her, you all finna die. School name, watch out." A chilling message. It wasn't just a prank. It wasn't a joke. Someone was making a serious threat, and they had a reason to be afraid. The chilling news didn't end there. In the chaos of the lockdown, it was revealed that earlier that day, a bus at another school in the county had been shot at. No one knew the full details, only that it was vague and unsettling. The uncertainty spread like wildfire, leaving everyone to imagine the worst. And yet, no one at the school would provide any answers. They were left to speculate. No information, no reassurance, only more fear. As the hours dragged on, he thought about his dad again. The base school was the primary target of the threat, and his father taught there. He couldn't shake the worry gnawing at his gut. His dad wasn't just some teacher, he was his father. The thought that something could happen to him in the midst of all this chaos was too much to bear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the students were allowed to leave the charter school. Although the air was still thick with tension, the buses were still running and they were told to head to their base school, even though the threat was still looming over it. What made no sense was that they were being moved to a place that was directly in danger. It was one thing to keep them safe at the charter school, away from the immediate threat, but now they were being sent directly into the heart of the storm. A bus had already been shot at that day, and now they were heading to a school that might be next. It didn't sit right with him, and as he stepped onto the bus, he felt that knot in his stomach tighten. They arrived at the base school, which was also locked down. They were ushered into the gym. Why the gym? Where they sat in silence, the tension palpable in the air. The gym, usually full of laughter and the sound of sneakers hitting the court, now felt like a holding cell. There was nothing to do but wait. They still hadn't been told much, and the fear was spreading among the students like a contagious disease. The worst part? No one really knew anything. They were all just left in the dark, dependent on rumors and snippets from the news to piece together the truth. And still, no word from his father. The minutes dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours, until the lockdown was finally lifted. The all-clear signal sounded, but the lingering unease didn't leave. There were too many questions and too many things left unsaid. And in the midst of this chaos, something else strange happened. A special ed student went missing. It wasn't until everyone was leaving, heading to their buses, that anyone noticed. How does that even happen? How does someone just disappear without anyone noticing? But it had happened, and no one could explain how or why. The day was over, but it didn't it? The fear, the confusion, the unanswered questions. They all followed him home that evening. But the story didn't end there. As unsettling as the day had been, things didn't calm down. The very next day, the district was thrown into another round of chaos that would leave a lasting impression on everyone involved. The day started like any other, but as soon as the lockdown was announced, confusion swept through the schools like a wave. Phones buzzed with notifications, teachers scrambled, and the air thickened with uncertainty. What was going on now? Was this another threat? This time, the cause of the lockdown had little to do with the previous day's drama. Instead, the district schools were suddenly under siege, all because of a rumor. It was about an armed robbery, or at least that's what people thought it was. Word spread quickly, fueled by Facebook and other social media outlets, that an armed robbery had just occurred at the local Zaxby's, a popular fast food chain. The panic started when a few posts from local residents started showing up online. The initial message claimed that an armed robbery had taken place, and the police were on their way. But there was a problem. The situation had already been diffused. The police had already resolved the issue an hour earlier. In fact, the only thing they were dealing with at that moment was a suspicious car parked outside the restaurant. There was no robbery, just an alert situation with a vehicle that they were keeping an eye on. But that didn't matter. The rumors had already spread. The fear had already taken hold. Within minutes, the schools were locked down, all because of a misunderstanding. No one had bothered to call the police to double-check the information. No one had bothered to confirm that everything was safe again. Instead, the schools responded to what was essentially a wild rumor, fearing the worst when the situation had long since been resolved. The lockdown wasn't even based on any real threat. Yet, here they were caught in the middle of a chaotic mess. Students huddled together in classrooms, their minds racing with thoughts of danger that weren't even real. It was as if the schools had learned nothing from the previous day. In an age of smartphones, Twitter, and Facebook, rumors spread faster than fire. And all it took was one quick post for an entire district to be thrown into a state of lockdown over nothing. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. Just yesterday, they had been in lockdown because of a real threat, a threat that had led to a shooting at a bus, and today, they were locked down because of a baseless rumor. But even though the situation was resolved hours ago, no one seemed to trust the truth. Fear was easier to believe than facts. But as the day went on, something even stranger began to unfold. The schools had gone into lockdown for no reason, but the parents? They didn't know that. They had no clue that the students were sitting in classrooms, locked away, afraid for their safety, all because of a wild rumor that had been blown out of proportion. No communication had been sent to the parents, no emails, no calls. They didn't know their kids were trapped in this lockdown, and that meant they were panicking too. Somehow, the truth was lost in all of this mess. It was hard to tell who was more affected, the students who were sitting through the fear, or the parents who were left outside, wondering if their children were safe. When the lockdown was finally lifted, there was no sense of relief, only exhaustion. There were no apologies, no explanations. Just the feeling of being trapped in a world where information was more easily manipulated than reality. The whole experience had been absurd, but what could they do? All they could do was go home and try to forget. But forgetting wasn't easy. It stayed with them, lingering, haunting. The fear from the day before. The feeling of being powerless in the face of an unknown threat. The mystery of the special ed student who had gone missing and no one had even noticed. All of it lingered in the background like a storm that hadn't fully passed. In the aftermath, it was easy to see how fear, real or imagined, could take hold of people. All it took was a single whisper, a single post online, to send everything spiraling out of control. And what had really happened that day? Nothing. The whole district had been on edge for hours over something that didn't even exist. And yet, no one felt safe anymore. No one trusted the system. The terror of not knowing what was happening, of being left in the dark, had shaken everyone to their core. The truth? It didn't matter. What mattered was that the fear had taken over. And once that kind of panic sets in, it's hard to shake. It was just another ordinary Friday afternoon at the high school. For most students, the day was winding down, the anticipation of the weekend hanging in the air. But for Sarah, that afternoon would be different, much different. Sarah had heard the rumors. Everyone had. Girl A, a student who used to date a guy named B, had broken up with him a few days prior. While breakups were a common part of high school life, this one seemed to stir something darker in B. His reaction wasn't one of sadness or anger, it was something deeper, something more dangerous. B's father had a gun he wasn't afraid to use. The whispers around school were growing louder by the hour. B had threatened to use it. He had threatened Girl A, and worse, he had made it clear that if anyone stood in his way, they'd pay the price. Sarah hadn't paid it much attention at first. After all, things like this were said all the time. But when B was spotted walking into the school that Friday afternoon, the rumors took on a much more serious tone. The school, recognizing the threat, immediately enacted a lockdown. The kind of lockdown that felt surreal. It was 45 minutes before the final bell, and yet the hallways felt eerily quiet. Teachers quickly ushered students into classrooms, and all of a sudden, the normal hum of school life stopped. Sarah, who had been working in one of the larger rooms, didn't know what was going on at first. She assumed it was some kind of drill, a regular safety procedure, nothing to worry about. At least, that's what she thought. But then, things started to feel off. From where Sarah sat, she could hear the low rumble of footsteps in the hallway. Then, the sound of a door handle turning. At first, she didn't think much of it. It wasn't uncommon for staff to check that doors were properly locked during lockdowns. But as the minutes stretched on, the tension in the room grew. Who was out there? Why hadn't the lockdown been lifted? And why was no one telling them anything? Sarah's mind began to race. She glanced around the large workroom, noticing how it was split into two separate sections by a glass partition. Both rooms were dark, save for the soft glow of the exit signs. There were no windows to the outside, just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, and the sound of people shifting nervously in their seats. Time seemed to slow. The clock on the wall ticked forward, and the heavy silence was broken only by the distant hum of radios or murmurs from the staff on the other side of the partition. Sarah didn't know how long they sat there, but when the bell rang, it didn't sound like the usual end-of-day chime. It felt strange, out of place. She watched the seconds tick by, 10 minutes after the bell should have rung, then 15. No one had come in to explain anything. No one had given them any instructions. It felt like they were suspended in time, waiting for something, anything to break the tension. And then, without warning, the lights in the other room snapped on. For a brief moment, Sarah thought it might be a mistake. Maybe the power had flickered. But when the door between the two rooms swung open, the sight that met her eyes was enough to freeze her to the bone. Police officers, armed, pistol holsters on their belts, and shotguns slung over their shoulders, their boots heavy against the tile floor as they moved quickly into the room. The officers didn't waste any time. They barked orders, demanding everyone put their hands on their heads. There was no room for hesitation, no time for anyone to question what was happening. Sarah's heart raced as she stood up, slowly lifting her hands above her head, joining the others in the room as they did the same. The air was thick with fear. No one spoke. The officers moved quickly, calmly, but their presence was enough to make the gravity of the situation sink in. Sarah hadn't realized until that moment just how serious the threat was. The officers herded them out of the workroom, instructing everyone to walk to the gymnasium. Hands still on heads, no one dared to speak, the only sound now being the shuffle of shoes against the cold floor. As they walked, Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The gym was already crowded with students, some visibly shaken, others standing quietly, eyes darting around, trying to piece together what was happening. The police weren't taking any chances. They frisked everyone before letting them into the gym, checking for anything suspicious. It was a process that felt too invasive, but no one protested. At that moment, no one dared to make a sound. There was no way of knowing whether B had made it into the building yet, or if they were still in danger. The school was now a lockdown, but the real danger could still be waiting. The gym was filled with students, staff, and police, all standing in tense silence. In the middle of it all, Sarah's mind kept spinning. Why hadn't they told them what was going on? Why hadn't anyone explained why they were being treated like criminals? As the hours wore on, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. But it wasn't just the uncertainty that unnerved Sarah. It was the realization that this wasn't just a scare. The lockdown lasted for what felt like an eternity. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the snowstorm had begun to sweep through the city. As the gym filled with more and more students, Sarah's thoughts couldn't help but drift back to B. Was he still out there? Had they caught him? No one seemed to know. The air in the gym was thick with uncertainty. Some students whispered nervously to each other, speculating about what was happening, but there was no clear answer. The police moved quietly through the room, their eyes scanning the crowd as they continued to ensure everyone's safety. After what felt like hours, Sarah was finally allowed to leave the gym, but the sense of relief was fleeting. The day wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was the kind of day where you could tell nothing would ever be the same, where even getting home felt like an impossible task. She had no idea how long the lockdown had lasted, but when she checked her watch, it was almost 7:30 p.m. This was supposed to be the time she'd be settling into her routine, heading home after an uneventful Friday at school. But now, with the snow falling heavily outside and the streets clogged with traffic, getting home was going to be a nightmare. Sarah lived across the city, a good 40 minutes by transit, usually a 20-minute bus ride downtown, and then another 20 minutes on the train. But tonight, it wasn't going to be that simple. The storm had made everything worse, and as she made her way outside, the bitter cold hit her immediately. The snow swirled around her, sharp against her skin, the wind biting as it cut through the layers of her coat. The bus came eventually, but there was something wrong. The driver wasn't following the usual route. Instead of taking the freeway, he veered off, taking side streets. Sarah tried to stay calm, but the uncertainty of the situation made her stomach churn. Why wasn't the driver sticking to the usual route? The roads were barely passable and traffic was a mess. But the bus driver didn't seem concerned. In fact, he seemed almost relaxed. As the bus wound through the snow-covered streets, the driver started picking up random people at bus stops, asking where they were headed. "If you're on my way, hop on," he said, not even bothering to charge them. Sarah sat in the back, watching the strange procession unfold. She didn't recognize any of the passengers, but none of them seemed particularly worried. They all seemed to share that same quiet sense of discomfort, just a little off, just a little strange. The trip, which usually took no more than 40 minutes, stretched on. The driver took back roads, maneuvering through the snow and ice with surprising skill. Sarah watched the world outside pass by, the white landscape blurred in the snowstorm. It felt surreal, as though the whole world had gone off its axis. 40 minutes into the detour, the bus finally arrived downtown, but the storm had made everything a mess. Streets were backed up, and the usual efficiency of the train system was starting to show signs of strain. At the station, Sarah stood at the platform, waiting for the next train to come through. The wind cut through her clothes, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself, her breath visible in the cold air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train arrived. The ride was thankfully smooth despite the storm. The LRT system was usually reliable, and tonight was no exception. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been off-kilter since the lockdown began. The strange bus ride, the lack of information about what had actually happened at the school, the sudden inexplicable chaos, it was all too much. By the time Sarah finally made it home, the night had deepened and the streets were almost empty, save for the occasional snowplow and a few determined pedestrians braving the storm. The clock read 9 p.m. as she stepped into her apartment. It had been hours since the final bell had rung, and the weight of the day was only now beginning to settle in. The snowstorm outside was still raging, but inside, Sarah felt a strange calm. She was safe at least for now, but the events of the day had left a mark on her, a lingering unease that she couldn't shake. B's threats had been real. The lockdown had been necessary. And somewhere out there, someone had been walking around with a shotgun, a weapon that had never been far from his mind. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it. The fear, the uncertainty, the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. Inside, Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment, still shaken by everything that had transpired. She replayed the events of the day over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it all. The lockdown, the armed police, the feeling of helplessness as she sat in that dark room, wondering if she was going to make it home in one piece. But it wasn't until later that Sarah learned the truth about what had happened that afternoon. She hadn't realized it at the time, but while she was stuck in the gym, unaware of what was going on, something far more terrifying had been unfolding. It turned out that B had indeed made it into the school. The authorities had discovered that he had been walking through the hallways, making his way toward Girl A. Weather. He intended to confront her or something far worse, no one could say. But the police had been ready, and they had intercepted him before it was too late. When Sarah heard the details from a friend who worked at the school, the gravity of the situation hit her harder than ever. B had been carrying a shotgun, and when he was confronted by police, he hadn't hesitated. The officers had ordered him to drop the weapon, but B had refused, his eyes wild with desperation. It was only through sheer luck and professional training that no shots were fired, that no one was hurt. They had been just seconds away from a tragedy. As she sat there, digesting the details, Sarah couldn't help but feel a cold shiver run down her spine. She had been so close, so dangerously close to being in the middle of something far worse than a lockdown drill. It was terrifying to think about how quickly things could have spiraled out of control. But that wasn't even the worst part. As Sarah's friend continued to fill her in on the story, she learned that B had been acting strangely for days before the incident. There had been rumors that he had been planning something. The warning signs were there, but no one had taken them seriously enough to act. It was only after B's threats became more specific, more direct, that the school had decided to take action. The lockdown had been the last line of defense, a necessary step, but one that came far too late. As she sat alone in her apartment, Sarah realized just how lucky she had been. The thought of a shotgun being pointed in her direction, of everything she had gone through that day, felt surreal now, like it had all been some horrible dream, but the truth was far worse. She had been inches away from being part of a tragedy that could have unfolded in a place she had always considered safe. The snowstorm outside had finally started to let up, and the streets were slowly returning to normal. But Sarah knew that she would never see the world the same way again. The events of that day had opened her eyes to how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. One moment, she was sitting in her room, completely unaware of the danger just outside. The next, she was part of a story that no one would ever forget. As she prepared to go to bed that night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unanswered questions. What if B hadn't been intercepted? What if the police hadn't acted so quickly? What if they had been too late? The thought haunted her, lingering in her mind as the storm outside finally subsided. The world was quieter now, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. Life had a way of catching you off guard, of throwing you into situations you never expected. And when that happens, you realize just how quickly everything can change. And as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder if there were other threats out there, waiting, watching, just out of sight.